Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. Ronald Levant. Dr. Levant is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Akron, former president of the American Psychological Association, and former president of APA Division 51, the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. He's widely considered one of the key people responsible for creating the new field of psychology of men and masculinities, and is listed among the top 2% of scientists in the world, according to the Elsevier Stanford University database. Dr. Levant has authored numerous books, including Masculinity Reconstructed, The Tough Standard, and Assessing and Treating Emotionally Inexpressive Men. His work has fundamentally shaped how we understand masculine development and the challenges men face in our modern world. Dr. Levant, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Wes. It's good to be with you.
So you have spent decades studying what you call normative male alexithymia, this difficulty many men have in recognizing and expressing emotions. Can you help us understand how this develops in young boys and what you've discovered about the trauma and pain that boys often inflict on each other during those formative years? I know you have some powerful passages in your work about this. And of course, if you wouldn't mind sharing one of those with us, we'd be happy to hear too.
Here's the thing, and let me kind of bring another dimension into what you've mentioned. Boys and men are doing more poorly relative to girls and women on just about every educational, health, and social indicator there is today. A large part of that has to do with the very question you've raised, masculine socialization. So let me just sketch out the big picture, if you will. The time I lived through, but before you were here, in the 1950s, excuse me, women had fewer rights than they do today, and very few were in the workforce. In fact, mothers of small children, percentage participation in the workforce was in the single digits in 1955. And this was, the immediate aftermath of World War II, the baby boom. So a lot of women, were married, were mothers. And that was, to grow up in the 50s was like, I lived on a block that was on a semi cul-de-sac. And, we would all come home from school and rush out in the street and organize a quick game of softball or a tag football. There were so many kids in the same age range. And, the moms were looking out the window. So if anything went awry, there'd be a mother that would notice it, would attend to it. And that all began to change, and quite dramatically. So that by 1985, 50% of mothers of small children in the workforce. In 30 years, it went from single digits to 50%. And this was aided by childcare, which was a new innovation that enabled mothers to, hire someone or go to a childcare center and have care for their child or children while they worked. Women essentially achieved financial independence from men, and then they started to leave bad marriages in droves. So by 1965 to 1985, which is considered the divorce revolution, a massive amount of divorces occurred during that period, to the point that one half of all marriages were expected to end in divorce. And a little known fact is 2/3 of these divorces were initiated by the wives. This was aided again by a social innovation called no-fault divorce, which made it easier to divorce. You didn't have to, call your partner an abuser or unfaithful or any of the other conditions. You could simply divorce because you wanted to. So, and then over this era and into our era, there were millions of conversations between mothers and daughters and grandmas and granddaughters and aunts and nieces about how to navigate a world of changing gender relations and what was needed for girls to become autonomous women. And you see the results today. Women are admitted to and graduate from universities at a greater rate than men. There are more women in graduate and professional schools. I'll give you an example. I taught at the University of Akron's MA PhD program in counseling psychology. Almost all of my students were women. Whereas when I started in 1975, my first academic job, which was at Boston University, it was again it was an MED EDD program, but it was also in counseling psychology. So it was a master's and doctoral program. And, they had to have their bachelor's in both cases to be admitted. All of my students at BU were men. So 1965 to 2025, 50 years. And this is just kind of a snapshot of one particular program, but this has been replicated over and over and over all across the country. Health. Let's talk about health. Men's health die 5.3 years earlier than women on average. And so the longevity is 5.3 years less. I think it recently might have gone up. I don't have the exact stats. So what I'm telling you is maybe a couple of years old. And they also have more diseases in every category of illness there is. And this is not due to something biological. I mean, there's a small biological effect that women's sex hormones, estrogen, and progesterone have kind of a buffering effect on health, but the effect size is tiny, so it's not a big deal. The big deal is men's behavior. Men engage in at least 30 voluntary behaviors that put their health at risk. They wear seatbelts less often than women. They consume more alcohol than women. They use more tobacco products than women. They consume more illicit drugs than women. They take greater risks than women. They don't visit their physicians when they're sick. They don't take medications as prescribed. They have poorer diets. They don't regularly exercise. I mean, the list goes on and on. So, we're dealing with a serious problem of men in our society. And I hope shows like yours can reach some of these men and say there are other ways of being. And the key problem, we go back to the childhood socialization thing. Boys know that the worst thing they can do is walk, talk, act, or throw like a girl. So anything a girl does, a boy avoids. Some of the things that girls do that boys avoid are extremely beneficial to living, such as emotional self-awareness, emotional expressivity, empathy, and compassion. And, and boys avoid these because they're done by girls. So they lack, certain kind of, I would call them social skills, social emotional skills, many men. And that gets, and also, I mean, the thing about boys is that their behavior is policed by other boys. And you probably know this from your childhood. I certainly know it from mine. I mean, let's take crying, right? I mean, yeah, 4 or 5-year-old boy, I mean, it's no big deal if they cry, except it is. And, boys don't cry and boys get punished for crying. If you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to really cry about, my father used to say. Now, and crying, I mean, all humans have tear ducts, right? And crying releases hormones like oxytocin that relieve sadness. So why shouldn't boys cry, right? And if you want any further proof, consider the shortest sentence in the Bible. Do you know what that is?
Jesus wept.
Good, exactly. So if it's good enough for Jesus.
That's the truth.
So anyway, so I've covered a lot of territory here, and we can drill down on any of it, but that's kind of gives you the general landscape.
No, I appreciate you mentioning all of those factors, from the academic to childcare to divorce. I'm curious, in your estimation of all of those trends that changed, which one or which of them were the tipping point to really start making men head in a negative direction? Because if I'm understanding correctly, it would be one thing if boys maintained some sort of the stat or the norm and dipped a little bit, right? And then girls just slowly increased. But it seems like what you're saying is there's been a drastic reversal in the graph, that essentially boys are drastically going down and girls are drastically going up. And I'm curious if you could just speak to that trend and why you may think that be.
Actually, the way I would describe it, Wes, is girls are an upward curve like this, and boys are flatlined. So boys are still living, and I have evidence that boys are still being reared the same way I was in the 90s and 50s, to be tough and to be unemotional and girls settle arguments through conversation. Boys settle arguments through their fists. It may be unique. I grew up in kind of a working class neighborhood where the fathers of all of my friends worked in factories. It may be different in a more upper middle class environment. Mine was that way. I'm not sure about that point. But so, I think, what we're dealing with is we need to break up this fixation on the traditional masculine role, the tough, dominant, utterly self-reliant, never needs anything from anybody type of man, because that just doesn't work. I think we need to start raising boys to embrace their full human potential, their emotions, their empathy, their compassion. And these soft, skills that I'm talking about are enormously important, to living. So that's kind of where I think. I have a colleague who wrote a book that I tout. I don't know if I'll show it to you. I don't know if readers can see it. Can you see the cover of that?
Slightly, but if you want to read it out, we'll make sure to put it in the show notes.
Yeah, it's by Chris Regaluth, and it's called The Masculinity Workbook for Teens. And this is for middle school and early high school boys, adolescent boys, okay, boys just going through puberty and then being in puberty for a period of time. What happens during this period is that boys, obviously go through these physical changes. They're interested in girls that they avoided all the time up to there. They don't want to have anything to do with girls, not even their sisters, right? You're a girl, get away from us. You can't play baseball, you're a girl, right? To now the heterosexual boys, being intensely interested in girls and also getting fierce pressure to conform to masculine norms. So what this book does, and I've been recommending, what it does is it allows the boys to look at the pressure they're getting. It has them fill, it's like a workbook with it has questions and fill this out. Do you get a pressure to be tough and dominant and all that kind of stuff? And then it has the boys question the pressure they're getting in terms of their values, their family's values. There might also be religious values or cultural values, and to test the pressure they're getting against their own values so they can kind of decide. And I think the theme of this book, decide the kind of guy they want to be. And that I think would be essential. Not every school has these, and they may be in middle school, or they might be early in high school, called emotional and social learning classes. Have you heard of that? Yeah.
I have, but tell me more.
So I think there should be a module in there for the boys using a workbook like this. I'm not saying this is the only one. It's the only one I'm aware of that helps them buffer themselves against all this pressure and say, well, I really don't want to be unemotional. I really want to be able to say how I'm feeling. I don't want to shut myself down. I don't necessarily want to solve everything with fights. That was, when I grew up, that was how you solve things. You got into a fight. I would get into fights even if I knew I was getting my butt kicked. It was just the thing boys did, at least when I grew up.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. As you're talking about this middle school age, brings up a few things. It seems like as you were growing up, the father was present, but obviously not as emotionally available. And I find a lot of my adult male clients, male or female, struggle in the sense that they are aware that they need and want an emotional connection, usually particularly with their father. But the generational difference seems to make it feel like they're speaking a different language. And now you have, I have a 15-month-old.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's exciting. And I will certainly get that book for in a few years. Can't prepare soon enough. But essentially, I have guys my generation, they're raising boys. And ironically, the stats show that, men are spending an exorbitant more amount of time with their kids than they did, even like 10 years ago. But I still find there's the struggle of knowing what model do I follow. So a lot of men are still left with their hands open saying, I have this boy. How do I raise him? What do I do about it? And the conversation around what is the healthy model for helping a boy know what are some things he can aim at to become, like a man. And then after you speak to that, I would like to get into the middle school policing and all that you mentioned before.
Yeah. So, my answer to your question is boys should be who they are. So I mean, this is kind of a central element of Western civilization. Western civilization is founded on the idea of individualism, as contrasted with Eastern civilization, which is founded on the idea of collectivism. So collectivism means you kind of think about your group, your community, your family, your ethnicity, whatever first. And individualism, I guess, was best expressed by the poets who wrote about it. Socrates, to thine own self be true, or I guess he was be the self that you truly are. Shakespeare was to thine own self be true. So I think what I would say is, and boys know they're different. They know, what they're good at, what they're not good at. They have some ideas of how they feel about things. My advice to people who interact with young boys, and you will be, is to encourage them to find out who they are and be who they are. Just be the person that they're destined to be. And who that is kind of a combination of genetics and culture and all of that. The family obviously is a major learning environment for young children, and they learn from their parents, how their parents behave, how their parents handle conflict, how their parents, relate to other people in their family, their relatives, etc. So that's really my advice.
Well, it's interesting you say they learn from their family primarily, because I'm seeing this trend where, speaking of community and socialization, people are getting married at a far lesser rate. They're having kids at an even greater,
Lesser rate.
yes. And then on top of that, many people aren't living in community, especially men. A lot of fathers, a lot of, what is it? Men claim to have 0 to 1 close friends on average. And the most intimate person they can only speak to in their life is their wife, if again, they're married.
If they're
And
married.
so you're bringing up an interesting point where these boys are being raised. The father is around and the mother's around, but now you're going to school. It's primarily female teachers, primarily other girls around you, especially as you get older academically and employment wise, right? And then you come home and you actually don't see your parents interact with a lot of other people because they don't have many other friends. You don't see them interact with a lot of other family because a lot of people don't live near family. And then let's add this to the mix. We have social media competing for, and these kids especially, time and attention. And so I almost see this existential tension and paradox we're kind of butting up against, which is, I agree with you, a child's primary form of learning should be done in their most intimate relationships, which primarily usually occur at the home. But now we're seeing such a denigration and disconnect, a fragmented model, that I am wondering what that'll look like moving forward, considering it's not as cohesive and collective as it used to be. And that's on top of it already being an individualistic society.
Yeah, I mean, contrast sort of the social environment that I grew up in. Like I said, I would ride my bike home from school as quickly as I could. I would have to change out of my school clothes into my, play clothes, because that's just the way it was in my house, and run out to the street to see who's there. And there were just all these children, close to my age or a little bit older, a little bit younger. And we would organize games. And sometimes there'd be an adult might kind of venture and kind of organize things, whatever. But it was just such an opportunity to interact with a wide range of people. And so you got to know different personalities, as a child. And, some people, were bossy, and some people were, especially helpful, and all that kind of thing. But the social media thing is so, in some ways, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's some really insidious problems with it. So let's focus on young men right now. We typically define the age range of 18 to 29 as sort of young adult. And and what are these young men doing? Well, I know what they're not doing. They're not dating. I saw an article, I don't remember the source, I wish I had written it down, where a young man in his 20s was saying he really thinks he's not going to go on dates anymore because they're too much like job interviews.
I mean, I'm with you. You're kind of speechless, right? I mean, what
But
do you
I
think?
mean,
It'll
but it
just
all
come to you?
comes together. I mean, women have advanced and they know they've advanced. And when they date a man, they're going to want to know who he is before they even agree to a second date. And what kind of guy are you? And if you haven't answered that question in middle school, you're going to be, in deep trouble when you're a young adult. So, and what I'm hearing, and I don't know any studies on this, is that romantic interaction between young men and women mostly consists of, what we would call hookups. Basically, there are websites where, apps where you can hook up, get together, have sex, go your separate ways, and then do it again in another day. So that's just clearly not helpful. I hope it doesn't come to the level that it is in South Korea. Have you heard about the 4Bs movement?
No, tell me more.
Okay, so BIS in Korean means not. So 4Bs is 4 BISs, BIS, that expression, 4 nots. So it's no bis, well, I'll just say in English, no dating, no sex with men, no babies, no marriage. South Korean women have kind of and this was Asia, I think the gender divide, or what I call the crisis of connection between men and women. That's actually the title of an article I published in the late 90s, believe it or not. It was a slightly different crisis of connection. I would write a different article today. But there is a crisis of connection between men and women. And if the interaction between these people in their 20s is just to kind of arrange a quick hookup, and then that's it, and you never see the person again, we're in deep trouble as a society.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm curious what you think about this. I'm wondering, you have this age group of young men you're talking about in the US, and then the more or less a similar age group for women in South Korea. For the ones in the US, this, not working, not dating, just having sex. And by the way, that guy who knows even what a job interview is probably better than half the guys out there not even working, So
Yeah.
given all those stats, right, and knowing that the average guy is essentially not trying, like you're saying, they're keeping the line flat. Do you feel that it's the inflection point of middle school and that policing of being bullied, teased, and having that social exclusion that essentially sends a boy on one or two paths? It sends them into the more authoritative, let's say, in a power dynamic, authoritative path that is more confident, over assertive, and what we would traditionally call toxic masculinity, right? This kind of rise to the tyrannical of like, I'm in charge and I'm the one with all the power. I get all the women, I get all the social credits, etc. Right. And then let's say the have nots of the ones that are recipients of the bullying and teasing and create those insecurities. And those insecurities cause them to go down that other path, which essentially you become a shell of a human. You stop trying, you don't move forward. I'm curious, in your perspective, is that the inflection point where you see that divide that causes that age of 18 to 24 to present like that? Or how would you speak to that?
I haven't seen kind of I would call them clusters. I haven't seen the clusters you've described. And I'm looking for papers. I haven't seen any research that focuses on these issues, on young people. I mostly see articles in the popular press. There's one, I think it was in the Atlantic, that basically talked about a whole generation's refusing to grow up and referencing, young, mostly men, kind of still living in their parents' home and being in their late 20s and, not having a job and not, going to college. I mean, that's you think about it, going to college not only means that you're going to earn about $1 million more than somebody who hasn't gone to college on average. But it's not just the money. Going to college expands your way of thinking, provides you with tools for critically evaluating things. It gives so much. And men are just not doing that now. I mean, yeah, there are some men in college, but the numbers have shifted where it used to be, more men than women. It's now more women than men. So there's still men in college, there's still men in graduate school, but there are a lot of them who aren't, who could be. But one of the things I focus on, and you mentioned earlier, and I'd like to kind of bring it up now, which is this concept of normative male alexithymia. Your audience is probably saying, "What the heck is he talking about?"
I mean, I had to Google how to say it just to make sure I was getting it right. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people with doctoral degrees like to make things complicated.
Yeah, well, they made it complicated for you, right? So it's returning the favor.
Yeah, sure. So alexithymia literally means without words for emotions. It's a clinical idea that was developed in the 1960s and 70s by psychiatrists and psychologists who were studying psychosomatic disorders. Those are disorders in which there are physical symptoms but no physical cause. It's essentially, a psychological problem that causes damage to the body in some way. And so they were studying it, and they found that many of their patients, couldn't tell them if they were having an emotion or what it was. And so they coined this term, and they developed a way of measuring it. There was a scale. I don't remember when it was developed. It was probably a little bit later than that, maybe the 80s, maybe the 90s. I'm not sure. It's called the Toronto Alexithymia Scale 20. And the unique thing about this scale is it developed what are called clinical cutoffs that were developed actually assessing clinical patients and who could be judged by a clinical interview to be alexithymic and looking at their scores. So they established cutoffs. If you get above a particular score on this scale, you're considered alexithymic. In the late 80s, I was at Rutgers. I'd left Boston University, and I was focused on masculine norms, and I developed the first version of my scale, the male role norms inventory. But when I first started noticing that some men couldn't put their emotions into words. When I was at Boston University, I ran a project called the Fatherhood Project. Was developed actually in the late. I conceived of it in the late 70s. Actually, after I saw the movie Kramer versus Kramer. Do you know that movie?
I don't.
It's Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman portray a divorcing couple. Very timely movie, given that divorce was happening rampantly all around them. At the time I saw it, I was a divorced, semi-custodial father of a tween-age daughter who lived with me for the summers. Her mother and her lived in New York. I lived in Boston. I would visit during the academic year on the weekends, and then she would since I wasn't working in the summer, she would reside with me. And as a semi-custodial father, I considered myself a miserable failure. I just didn't think I knew how to do fathering. And my own father was abusive and not exactly the role model that I would want to carry forward. And I had no idea how to do this. So I also wasn't in a relationship with a woman at the time, so I couldn't pawn my daughter off onto my girlfriend, right? I had to do it myself, and I kind of sucked at it, to be honest. And the movie, what happens is Meryl Streep, Mrs. Kramer, decides that she's going off to California to find herself. This was an idea. This was actually an idea in the popular culture that if you want to find yourself, you've got to go to California. All of the selves are in California or something. I don't know what the idea was. And so she left her 8-year-old son with her husband, and he did not have a clue. And he, essentially, kind of made I really highly recommend that film. You could probably get it on Netflix. But he messed up badly, and that helped me kind of have what I call a slow-moving epiphany, that it wasn't that Ron Levant was such a lousy father, but that men of my generation really had not been prepared to be kind of hands-on, do everything parents in the same way that girls of my generation were. There was no expectation. My dad, his way of spending time with me and my brother was to supervise us while we did some chore, like cutting the grass or something like that. That was his quality time. You missed a spot right over there. Anyway, so I started thinking, okay, well, what is obviously, there are a lot of dads like me who are divorced, and they have their kids for periods of time, may have joint custody, whatever the situation is. And what is there to help them perform this role? And there was nothing. I did a literature search. All of the studies on parent education either stated there were no fathers or didn't even bother stating it, and you had to assume it. So there was nothing for fathers. So I developed this fatherhood course, and it involved teaching kind of how to communicate with children and how to understand child development and how to manage children's conflicts like sibling rivalry and things like that. I put it together with a graduate student who basically tested it as his dissertation, his doctoral dissertation. So the course, and also I got a grant of like $35,000 in 1982 money is probably worth, I don't know, 100,000 now. But I used all that money to buy video equipment. So I had more video equipment than a sane person would ever want. And video was really cool in the 90s, and I had the best equipment money could buy. So we would advertise that we're offering the fatherhood course. It was a non-credit course to the community. And BU did this because it was kind of in trouble with the community. The community had a lot of issues with BU kind of encroaching on land and expanding into surrounding communities. And the higher leadership of the university wanted to change the dynamics. So the community looked upon the university as a resource rather than an enemy. So they got a number of faculty to do things like I was doing. So I was doing the fatherhood course. And so when the men would come into the room, we'd advertise in the Boston Globe, free advertisement. The phones would ring. We enroll 10, 12, 15 men. They would come in once a week in the evening for a couple of hours. And, when they came in the room and saw this equipment, they said, wow, these guys must have it going on. And we said, yeah, we're going to teach you how to be a better dad the same way you might have learned a sport like golf or tennis. You're going to do it. We're going to record it. We're going to watch the recording and break it down and analyze it, figure out how to do it better. So we're doing this, and this is a long lead up to this particular man who started me on this journey. So I noticed that one of these evenings that one of the fathers seemed out of sorts. So I asked him, is something wrong? And he said, yeah, my son stood me up for a father-son hockey game. Now, anyone from Boston knows that hockey is very big. Plus, he was a divorced dad, and this was his way of connecting with his son. So I, not knowing anything about men and emotions, I said, well, how did you feel about that? And he said, he shouldn't have done it, pointing his finger, angry tone of voice. I said, I agree, but how did you feel? And he looked at me blankly. I said, okay, let's role play this. You play you, and another dad is going to play your ex-wife while she tells you that your son had forgotten about the date and had gone off with friends. So we do the role play, we record it. I'm sitting next to him looking at the monitor as his face falls into a frown and his shoulders slump, and I'm coaching him and I'm saying, look at yourself in the monitor. How did you feel? So he's going like this, rubbing his chin. I don't know. I guess I must have felt disappointed. I thought to myself, I guess I must have felt disappointed with this much coaching. I found it hard to believe. I imagined, how might a mother feel in an analogous situation like her daughter standing her up for a shopping date? And I'm going through this in my mind. Well, at first I was surprised. It's not like her to just stand me up. And then I was hurt that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. And then I was worried that maybe she was upset with me and this is her way of showing it. And then I was disappointed and annoyed because I built my whole day around this and now it was ruined. So I'm weighing these things. I guess I must have felt disappointed versus surprised, hurt, worried, disappointed, angry. I didn't get it. And I had a faculty meeting later that week. So I said, I need some time on the agenda. I need your input. These are about 8 or 9 psychologists. Here's the situation. I explained what I just told you. They came back to me. They were no help at all. I said, Ron, women are just more emotional by nature. I didn't buy that. I just couldn't believe that. So what I did is I went to the research literature in developmental psychology on a topic called emotion socialization. And I happen to know about this because in my doctoral program, I had the option to concentrate in child clinical. So I had to take more developmental psych courses than my classmates. And so I knew there was this area of literature, and it was mostly studies in the 70s. And this was like 82, so they were fairly recent. And I found some amazing things. First of all, as neonates, that's hours after birth, boys are more emotional than girls. But neonates don't do much. They cry and they sleep. These are little infants. But then I found the same finding among children 6 months of age and 1 year of age. Boys, again, 6-month children do a lot more than neonates, and 1-year-old children obviously do a lot more. But the boys were more emotional and judged to be more emotional than the girls. So what is this? Girls are more emotional by nature? But then at 2 years, the slopes start to switch. Girls, in a study of 2-year-old children, girls were found to be more verbally expressive emotions, which was measured by the number of emotion words they knew. Words for emotions like envy or joy or sadness or fear. And then the kicker was this ingenious study of 4 to 6-year-old children. The investigator asked mothers of 4 to 6-year-old children to bring their child, boy or girl, into the lab. And the child was in one room and the mother was in another room. The child was shown emotionally stimulating slides designed to stimulate a particular emotion in the child. The mother watched their child in another room through a video monitor. The question was, could the mother guess the type of slide shown to her child? That is, the slide was designed to evoke fear or envy or sadness or whatever. So at 4 years of age, mothers were equally accurate with boys and girls, but as the children aged, they grew less accurate with their sons. So boys between 4 and 6 lose their facial expressivity. And what's going on with boys between 4 and 6? They're in preschool or elementary school. And to bring back a construct we were talking about earlier, their behavior is being policed by their peers. Boys are not allowed to be emotional, at least during the time this study was done. I hope that may be changing. Given my work on masculine norms, I was aware that many people, one of the norms that they studied was restricting the expression of emotions. That was a masculine norm. Men are supposed to restrict the expression of emotions. And since I was aware now that boys were socialized and you could see the effects in literature to restrict the expression of their emotions, it seemed to me that boys who were reared that way had an elevated risk to grow up to be men who were alexithymic. Because if you tell boys you can't express emotions and then they live that way until they get to be adults, they're going to have a hard time expressing emotions if they can at all. So I called this construct normative male alexithymia. The word normative, sometimes people think I meant frequent. I meant reflecting norms, social norms. That was the intention. We have, in terms of frequency, we've never done a prevalence study in America, but there was one done in Finland, and it found that 17% of men and 7% of women met criteria for alexithymia, again, using that scale we discussed earlier. So I went about trying to, see if there was evidence for it in the United States. So I did 2 studies, both looking at comparing men and women on alexithymia. One was just a literature review, and the second was a study called a meta-analysis, where you statistically aggregate the results of different studies. And in both studies, I found that men met criteria for alexithymia more frequently than women. But like most sex differences in psychological characteristics, the effects were small. It's not a huge effect. It's a small effect, but it's there. So that's where I got the normative male alexithymia. And in the 90s, my kind of professional life changed. I left Rutgers, went into full-time practice, and took a part-time appointment at Harvard Medical School. And I wanted to test my ideas. So this will be kind of odd to your reviewers, but back then, the way you got patients is you advertised in the yellow pages. Sounds so archaic to say it, but the yellow pages were a big, thick book that advertised businesses. And so I had a big ad that says counseling for men and, all the other details. And I told my colleagues, send me the men that your women patients complain about. And so I got a caseload of men, many of whom were alexithymic. And I started experimenting with ways to increase their emotional self-awareness and overcome the alexithymia. We can talk about that if you want, but that's kind of a long story there. Sorry about the length of that.
No, I think hearing the experiential information in there was extremely helpful. And I think it would be good to dive into the more practical of how you create safety for someone who's learned that vulnerability is weakness. My one thought and question in that boys ages 4 to 6 starting to make that shift, I do also wonder um, if the male modeling of emotions from the father plays a role. And I'm curious your thoughts, meaning most of us grew up with a father that didn't really express emotion, and certainly not to us as a kid. Meanwhile, the mother did. And so if you're a daughter, you're growing up thinking, okay, mom, female like me, emotions like me. But boy, you look and say, okay, of course, that age too, who does a boy most want to be like? His father. Even as a father is super toxic, there's that deep, deep desire. And it's still ingrained. I find adult men who are still trying to please, their fathers. Curious if you feel like that factor plays into it.
Well, I think it's definitely a part of it for sure. When I talk about gender role socialization for boys, really it comes primarily from the parents, secondarily from schools, and tertiary from the community around the child. But the parents clearly are the role models, and parents actively instruct their children. I hope this isn't still happening. But when I grew up, my father would say, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to really cry about. You were not allowed to cry in my house. And there were just two of us boys in the house. There were no girls. And I don't think my family was all that different from other families in that era. It was just considered too girly to cry. There was
Well, take it a step further. I mean, still to this day, boys will use the phrase, don't be a wuss, you're gay if you express yourself. There's this attack on what I guess it's automatically interpreted as feminine if you show some sort of vulnerability or cry. It's not even a question, right? It's just automatically that's the category. And this is 2025 as far as we've come. I still know boys in middle school that use that kind of term, right? So, I mean, it's really interesting how that is kind of continued. That conditioning is so deeply seated.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you pointed that out. Yes. I mean, so we got a lot of work to do. No question about it. When I was in practice, I not only saw individual men, sometimes I would see families and, around a child who was having problems. And one family in particular I want to talk about, I saw the parents. I typically, would see the child separately and do play therapy, depending on the age, but do play therapy because children aren't used to sitting in a chair for 50 minutes and talking to an adult.
But then we make them do that in school, right? It's funny, right?
But so I would see the parents, and this particular couple brought up that, they wanted to raise their son to be kind of fully emotional, because they considered that, healthy. And I would agree with them. But they raised the question with me. So their son was around 7, and, we let him cry in the house, but we're worried, about, what's going to happen outside our house if he cries, and some people, punish him for that. So I said, you're very right to be concerned about that. It's a real possibility. I suggest you inoculate your son this way. Have a conversation with him in which you say something like, you can cry in our house because we think it's okay for boys to cry. Because crying makes you feel better when you feel sad, but not everybody thinks boys should cry. So you kind of have to know who you're around. And if you're around people that, kind of think boys shouldn't cry, you know, you should hold your tears until you're away from them, because if you cry in front of them, they might get mad at you. So you kind of explain it in child language. That's kind of how I coached the parents to talk to their child, to let the child know that this is okay, but there are situations that you may need to hide this because people have negative feelings about it. And you can explain why they have these negative feelings if the child's interested. But do you see the point I'm making here? Allowing the child to have his emotions, um, but also advising him to be wise about where he shows that.
Yeah, I think what I hear in there is the discernment of safety, who you feel safe and secure around, who you don't. And so I am curious if you can walk us through a man who struggles with emotionally expressing himself. How do you create safety for someone who's learning that vulnerability equals weakness? They believe that lie, and some first steps that a man can take if they do want to mature and say, listen, I get it. I have an issue. My wife's the one that tells me the emotions I'm experiencing, which is why I'm here, so I can know that. So yeah, if you could just speak to that.
Sure. Well, let me just give you an example of what you just said, and then I will talk about how to fix it. Another couple I was seeing, uh, and had been seeing, I guess, for a few months, came in one week with a new situation that I wasn't aware of. And this was in the 90s. The husband was starting to transition. In the 90s, we did not know anything about transgender people. And in fact, we referred to men who did this as transvestites. You may have heard that word. So this particular man was, dressing in women's clothing at home, and his two young daughters, ages 7 and 9, had come in when he was dressed in his favorite outfit, which is a ballet tutu. And this caused a little bit of, kind of a mini crisis in the home, and they brought it up. So again, I'm, still kind of naive about men and emotions, and I haven't really figured it all out completely. So they're relating this, and I turned to the husband and I said, well, how did you feel when your daughters walked in on you? And he looked to his wife and asked, how did I feel? And she said, you were embarrassed. So there's a great example of what you just said, where I actually interacted recently with a philosopher who discovered my work, and she used the term hermeneutic burden. Now, for people in the audience who may have taken a philosophy class in college, hermeneutics refers to interpretation of meaning. And so her thesis was that there's a burden on wives to interpret the emotions of their alexithymic husbands. And I actually did a podcast with her, and she and I were profiled in an article in the Washington Post about this whole thing. But so it's really spread, and, it's actually got on TikTok, and a TikTok influencer did a whole thing about normative male alexithymia. And it was an angry rant against men, but it was just delightful, that women are saying, hey, I don't want to be your emotion interpreter anymore. You have to learn how to do this for yourself. So then the question is, how do they learn? And maybe some of the men who are listening to this may benefit from what we're talking about, because, it's not rocket science to learn how to express your emotions as an adult man. It's a series of stages you kind of have to go through. And therapy is like that. Therapy often involves stages. So I start off with developing a vocabulary, for emotion words. And I would ask my client, well, first of all, I'd have to get his buy-in to this process. So you mentioned that earlier. How are you going to get me? So a lot of the men in my practice were sent by someone else. They were told to come to call a psychologist, and they called me. They didn't wake up one morning and said, gosh, I think I have normative male alexithymia. I better call Dr. Levant. No, that didn't happen. And so I have to kind of, sell my method to them. I have to say, you're coming here because your wife is concerned because you don't seem to able to say what you're feeling, to express your emotions. And like you, we're kind of both raised to not express emotions. So you're going to have to go against a little bit of the grain of what you learned as a child. And are you down with that? And they say no. Well, okay, we'll do something else. But most of the men I've treated said, yes, let's do that. So I would start off with vocabulary, because I found that alexithymic men have a very poor vocabulary of emotion words. Most of the emotion words that alexithymic men know are words for anger, pissed off, annoyed, irritated, furious. I mean, it just goes on and on. So I say, I want you between now and the next session to think of as many emotion words as you can and write it down and bring it in. And then I would slip in a little bit of competition and say, a guy I saw earlier today came in with 30 words. And I can be sure this guy is going to come in with 31.
You just keep making the number higher. This guy had 100.
If they get to 31, I'm happy.
Yeah, that's pretty high to begin with. You're right.
So, okay, I guess I should have said there are about 4 stages to this whole thing. So we did stage 1. Stage 2 is, I found it's easier to teach men to read the emotions in other people than it is to read their own emotions. So I teach them about nonverbal communication, about facial expression, about tone of voice, about paralinguistic things like sighs, cries, or gasps, like body language. And I can go over this in 15 minutes and they can get the general idea. So I would say, okay, during the week, as you're interacting with a person or just people watching or even watching TV, ask yourself the question as you focus in on an individual, what is he feeling when he's saying that? What is she feeling as they're saying that? To kind of get them to, develop what we psychologists call theory of mind, of trying to infer from behavior what the other person might be feeling. That usually for alexithymia takes a couple of weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. It's not easy. But when they get that, then I move to identifying emotions in themselves. Now, some of the men that I worked with were so alexithymic, they didn't actually experience the emotion as an emotion. They experienced it as a bodily sensation, and you may have patients like that yourself, where they talk about butterflies in my chest, or, I feel like I got a stiff neck, or my legs keep wanting to move, so they refer to something going on in their body, which I infer as the physiological part, the physiological arousal that leads to emotion state. But because they're so alexithymic, they don't actually experience it as an emotion. So I've got to get them over that hump. So I say, I want you to keep an emotional response log. It can be fairly simple, like, some 3x5 cards in your shirt pocket. And whenever you experience an emotion or a bodily sensation, for the guys that don't experience emotion, write it down. What exactly are you experiencing? Then ask yourself the question, who is doing what to whom? And how does that affect me? And then go through your vocabulary list and pick out the word or words that describe how you're feeling. So it's a very basic, almost kindergarten way of teaching emotions, which is really appropriate because these men's ability to identify their emotions was interrupted when they were very young. So a kind of a basic approach is fully appropriate. So I'll give you one example. A man came in with his emotional response log. I was feeling butterflies in my stomach. My situation was expected feedback on a progress report from my supervisor at noon, and it's 3:30 and I haven't heard from him yet. And I know he's here. Okay, going through the list of words. What am I feeling? Butterflies in my stomach. Didn't get the report. There it is. Apprehensive. I'm feeling apprehensive. So that's kind of gives you an idea of how the men are expected to work, in this. And what I found, and I made a video to show this, is, once they learn how to do it, a lot of buried emotions come up because they now have skills to put these emotions into words and to talk about them. The video I made is of a man who felt nothing about his impending fatherhood. His wife was pregnant, and he was just, stone cold about it. No fear, no joy, no nothing. I went through a process similar to this. This was a little early on before had different versions, slightly different versions of this as I developed it. He began to experience his emotions, and what he experienced is a great deal of anger at his father because he idolized his father and wanted to interact with him. His father was always too busy and just didn't have time for the son. And his father was a publisher of the newspaper in the small city that they lived in. So the son, when he went to high school, became the editor of the school paper. He wanted, to kind of be like his dad. And his dad just kind of blew him off. And so once he was able to kind of get into his emotions, what came out is a tremendous amount of grief at, he really wanted his father to be to be a friend, to be with him as a boy, and his father had no time for him. So does this give you an idea of how this can work?
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate how you put it in different stages and different exercises and practices in each one. I think it's very helpful both for me as a clinician to use in the session, but also more so for any guy to name and be able to see where am I at in this level. I've never thought about this, but it's all kind of converging in my mind. I'm curious what you think about this. Is you're saying that men aren't don't know how to express their emotion, and that roughly middle school is the time with that policing age where they really start shutting down emotionally, right?
Mhm.
That's also the typical age we would find traditionally rites of passage that happen.
Hmm.
That's also the typical age where you start finding, like you're saying, boys are interested in girls and they start changing their relationship to other boys as primarily competition, right? Because the sex drive kicks in. You're no longer my friend. Now you're the guy that's trying to get with the girl that I'm trying to get with. And this whole convergence happens at this stage that really determines so many long term effects that I didn't even think about of not being able to express yourself emotionally, not knowing how to date, not knowing how to make friends with other boys. And I see it also with the trauma informed lens, that you're bringing up these things where this man essentially had a trauma trigger of his unmet needs in childhood that he buried, thought was normal or wasn't a big deal, something he could just gut out or, grit through. And then now he's in a similar stage where he's basically unintentionally reenacting the trauma as it played out by shutting down emotionally because that's what happened to him. And how
Hmm.
many men essentially, I guess what I'm saying to kind of summarize this, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. For many men to mature, they have to heal the inner boy within. And you have to go backwards before you can go forwards. And it feels counterintuitive, and it's easier to say, let's just fix the problem, teach you these things, aim at things, overcome it, go for it. But I actually find the ability to go back. And like you said earlier, it feels, elementary, like, oh gosh, this feels so overly simple. What's the point? Why do I need to do this? But yet that actually feels like a crucial step. I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think you've summarized it very, very well. What we're talking about here is helping, men reclaim, their full humanity. How can you be in love if you can't feel love? I mean, you might feel lust, and a lot of adolescent boys obviously feel a lot of lust. We know that. We've both been adolescent boys, but love and appreciation and compassion and empathy and warmth and all of these things, that make, life worth living, frankly. Um, that you're shut out of. It's so sad. I often feel very sad when I meet. I'm not in practice anymore, but I was supervising my students. I ran the training clinic at the University of Akron where we trained our future psychologists. And so I supervised a good number of them. And, so I would, watch videos of them interacting with their patients and I would coach them. And I'd see a lot of male patients who were alexithymic and could really benefit from this.
Yeah, I agree. There's a deep sadness. I feel it for my own self and my own healing. I lost my father at age 11, and I imagine you feel that too. And speaking of loss, there's a topic to shift gears slightly. It's a little more sombering, but it's something I'd like you to speak to if you're open to it. In your personal journey, you've written about experiencing depression and even a suicide attempt in your 20s, which takes a tremendous amount of courage to share. And first of all, just thank you for doing that. I think you're leading the way in making it a necessary aspect for many men suffering in silence to share. I mean, how many men are experiencing something similar? I know have been through severe bouts of depression as well. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to either from memory read the passage where you reflect on that or just speak to how those experiences really informed your professional understanding of men's mental health.
Thank you for that question. I'm a trauma survivor. My father was physically abusive from the age of 2. I don't remember it. My uncle told me about it, where my father, I was 2 and I had a toilet training accident because 2 is when that happens. And my father hit me for the accident. And my uncle and my grandfather were present and told me about this incident, but he was physically abusive at multiple points for me as a boy. And in addition, as if that weren't enough, I was bullied by anti-Semitic boys from the age of 5. I'll tell you that little story because it's kind of interesting. So my father was in World War II. He was in the Navy and the war was over. And the end of the war, all of these GIs were coming home and there were these loans to veterans to be able to buy houses. So my father bought a house in Southern California for 5,000
Oh my gosh.
in 1950, I think, something, or 48, something like around there. And it was a small home, but it was a tract home. but there were a lot of other little families like ours there. But so and I think it was moved in right around the time I was 5. So I was very adventurous. So I was out exploring the neighborhood. I met a couple of boys, and we were playing in a tent in one of the boys' backyards. And the boy said, "Let's all say what we are." So one boy said, I had no idea what they're talking about because I sometimes pretended to be a rhinoceros because I was 5. And um, so one boy said, "I'm Protestant." The other boy said, "I'm Catholic." And I said, "I'm Jewish." And the two of them started laughing. Well, what the? I didn't swear because I didn't know swear words at the age of 5. And then they jumped on me and started hitting me. So I got up and ran away, tears streaming down my face. I come in the house. I tell my mom what's happening. My dad's at work. So my mom says, "Okay, why don't you play inside and we'll discuss it when your father comes home." I didn't do that. I got up. I mean, I was that kind of boy. And so I got up. I wanted to explore the neighborhood even more. So I was avoiding the house where this occurred, but I was walking in the neighborhood and I feel this sharp ping in my thigh. And I see the Catholic boy who is my age and an older boy, teenager, with a gun. It was a BB rifle. He shot me in the leg with a BB gun. And I went home and I told my mom that happened. And when my dad came home, he went over to the Catholic boy's house and asked to speak with the dad. Uh, I, being a 5-year-old without any better sense, ran home and got a knife for my father. I don't know what. I was thinking he'd have to get into a knife fight. My father told me, "Go home, take the knife home." Anyway, he had a conversation with the father of the Catholic boy. And the father of the Catholic boy said, "Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it." And I didn't have any trouble after that. So it didn't involve any kind of physical confrontation. It was a conversation. But, you know, that didn't end bullying for me. That was just the beginning chapter. Um, again, I was kind of an adventurous boy. I don't remember when I got my bike, maybe 7 or 8. But I would ride all over. Southgate was the community we lived in. And encounter a group of boys and they would say, "There's the kite, let's get him." And I would get beat up. That was basically what happened because it would be 2 or 3 on 1. And but I guess around 8 or 9, I was really sick of this. And so I joined the YMCA and enrolled in a boxing class. And my uncle, who kind of suspected I was getting beat up, bought me a set of weights, a bench and a barbell and some plates. And I was mowing lawns because money was very tight. And my family was saving every penny for my father to buy he was a printer. He wanted to buy a printing business. So I mowed lawns to get some extra money. I also would put together balsa wood airplanes for kids and charge them for that. And I also had a stamp collecting business. So I was kind of a little entrepreneur. So I always had a little money. And so I bought myself a speed bag. And so I learned how to defend myself. And the next time, I got "Hey, there's the kite, let's get him," I stood my ground. I got into a boxing stance, I'm moving around, and they're laughing at me. I'm still standing there. I'm ready for it. One boy steps forward. It's, like 1, 2, 3, and the kid's on the ground. And that was the end of it with the bullying. The word got around, "Hey, that kite can fight." I didn't get the bullying, but that was my answer. That was my solution to that problem. And then my father, though, continued to be a problem. And at the age of 13, I beat him up and ran away from home. I'll have to tell you the story of how that happened. I was very precocious. I had a girlfriend at the age of 13. And I had my father had it as a teenager that I could go out one night a weekend, but I had to tell him the week before which night. So I was very, meticulous about this because I really wanted to go out and see my girlfriend. And so one night I'm getting ready to go out. He says, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to Bobby's." "No, you're not. You didn't tell me." I said, "Yes, I did." So we got into a physical fight. I got on top of him. I beat him up. I don't know. He says he let me win. I don't think so. But anyway, I went over to Bobby, or actually ran over to Bobby's house. And she had an older sister who had a boyfriend. Sister was 17, boyfriend was 17. He had a friend who was 16. Somehow I persuaded these two boys to drive me from Los Angeles to Texas.
Wow.
I should have been a salesman.
Yeah, entrepreneur, salesman, you got it all.
I don't know how I did it. I mean, and they did. They drove me the reason I went to Texas is I had a friend from Southgate Junior High who moved to Texas, and we corresponded, writing letters to each other. So I had a destination. I wanted to go to this friend. I wanted to get out of my father's house. And understandably, my friend's mother was very nervous about the situation and didn't really want to get involved in another family's mess. So I got a job stacking hay at a farm, and I earned enough money to rent a room in a rooming house and to get meals. And I lived like that probably for a couple of months. And then I got some kind of infection that became a bronchial infection, and it wasn't going away. So I called my mother and she sent me a bus ticket, and I went home. My father never laid a hand on me. But here's the big but. As you probably know, abused children often become delinquent as adolescents, and I did. So the running away from home was probably my first act of delinquency. I think I had to see the police. I think they informed the police. I think I had to see the police after I got home. There were no big consequences. At the age of 15, I was arrested for drunkenness and vandalism. At the age of 17, I was expelled from high school for a truancy scheme. So I was not on a good path. I mean, given the direction I was going in, it's highly unlikely you would be talking to me now if I stayed on that path. I would either be in jail or dead. But what turned it around was a friend of mine. So I had to go to a different high school because we had to my mother won this marriage-long argument with my father. So my family's Jewish, as I implied. My mother was mildly observant. My father considered himself an atheist. Southgate, in addition to being anti-Semitic, had no synagogues. So we had to go to a neighboring town, my brother and I, for Hebrew school because we had to be bar mitzvahed by my mother's wishes. So my mother won this argument, and she said it's the goyim that's ruining Ronnie. Goyim, for your audience, is a negative Yiddish word for Gentiles or Christians, and it's probably the equivalent of kike for Jewish people. So we moved to the most Jewish part of Los Angeles, the Borscht Belt. It's right next to the La Brea tar pits, if any of you know Los Angeles. And I went to Fairfax High School, which advertised itself as 98% Jewish. And even at the time, I wondered how they could measure a fluctuating statistic so precisely. But anyway, I was in a Jewish high school. I managed to graduate, but I had no direction. So after graduation, I'm sitting around my house looking at military brochures. Which branch of the military should I join? When a friend came over, and he was a friend from Fairfax, and he asked me to accompany him. He was going to Los Angeles City College to take the admissions test. Well, it's college. Nobody in my family ever went to college. I'm a little nervous. So I said, sure. So I took the test and I got into City College. And you probably know that faculty at City College don't have PhDs. They likely have master's degrees, but they're street smart. And I got a lot of benefit from the faculty there. Probably changed the vector of my life from essentially being a criminal to, going to college. And I discovered that I was good at something besides getting into trouble. It turns out I was very good at math. And so after 3 semesters at Los Angeles City College, I got into the flagship university of the University of California system, Berkeley, which was even more elevated in 1962 because it was really the site of, they had a world-renowned physics department there. And the university as a whole was very highly rated. I think it's lost some of that, but I think it was ranked above UCLA and all of the other UC campuses. I don't know if it is still now, but that was a life-changing thing from City College to Berkeley. And, it's really why I'm here talking to you now.
Wow, what a powerful story. And I appreciate you sharing all of that. I think what I'm drawn to most in hearing that and my thoughts. Of course, please edit my translation if it's needed. But there's this concept I've been mulling over about how bullying and abuse are misexpressed forms of love through physical touch. So instead of receiving a hug or a pat on the back, you receive a punch in the face and you internalize that. And I know you probably know the person who did this study of the rough and tumble play correlation with boys being antisocial later in life. And the key word I pull from that study is the word play. It's the healthy, intimate bond between a father and a son, where the son learns the limits through safety and love and security. Essentially, he feels safe enough to mess up and to be chastised and refined in order to be properly socialized later. Well, if instead of rough and tumble play, what you get is severe abuse and a really unhealthy power dynamic. It strips you of the safety, it strips you of the love, it strips you of the healthy bond, and it essentially sets you up to be a fragmented, disconnected person. And then your view of what love is and intimacy is essentially based on all of that, which speaks to why you would have this antisocial behavior, because in some ways that's the only you felt more comfortable and intimate doing those things than you did playing by the rules, staying within the limits and connecting with people in a healthy way, because hell, you didn't get that growing up. And I just hear that in your story, this transformation that's happened, but then this redemptive arc that you've led us to today, that not only have you written about men and you have accomplished everything you have, but it wasn't like your cards were so easy in your younger years and you still made it here. And so it's encouraging for me as someone who's gone through my own trauma and working my way up in my career, and hopefully it's encouraging for many guys to say, even if you had the terrible situation that you did, the cards you were dealt, you can still become someone that really gives back and is generous and is loving, is psychologically stable, and is bettering man.
I've written my memoir, and at the end of the chapter, this takeaway lesson. So it was really written for, men who've suffered abuse, who are struggling in life, and to try to offer inspiration and maybe some practical suggestions for how they can, get on a upward track and have a successful life. So it really is. So and by the way, if you're a Kindle reader, it's on sale for 99 cents at Amazon. The book is called The Problem with Men. It was, it, it was an Amazon bestseller for a short time in new releases in gender studies.
Where can people find your work?
Well, my website, drronaldlevant.com, and I've got all my books up there. I've got, for people who are interested, I've got op-eds. These are opinion pieces I've written for newspapers. And for researchers, there's a section where I've developed a number of psychological scales. Researchers can, request scales through that. And also for the media, if they want to contact me, I have that.
Okay, great. Well, we'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. And Dr. Levant, I just appreciate you being so generous with your time. I've truly not just enjoyed this conversation, but it's just felt so healing and inspiring to speak with you. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being at least a symbolic father in this field and someone who really was the forerunner in a lot of this. And please just be encouraged that there's people like me that have been impacted by your work and desire to take the baton and keep it going for the good of men. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for that, because that really is my deepest desire, is for younger men like yourself, like you say, to take the baton. It's a relay race, right?
Yes.
It doesn't stop with one runner. To take the baton and take it to another level.
Yes.
That's really my deepest desire. So thank you for having me on the show, and I want to thank your audience for listening to me.
Yes. Thank you. And guys, until next time.